All right, welcome back, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Last week we took a bit of a break. Colton had Special Olympics to go to, so Carl and I were cheering him on at Michigan State University. It was a good experience. Glad the weather was much better a week ago than it is this week for sure. About a 30-degree temperature swing, not much, just a bit in the way of a chilly spring, but we're back. There is tons to talk about. And so without further ado, I guess we'll just get rolling right into it. Why mess around? What I wanted to focus on, more than anything is kind of trade flows and things like that this week, market share, all of that good stuff. But I did want to start with Eduardo, and just kind of like we do every week, give us a bit of the lay of the land, the things that you're watching, what has taken place over the last couple of weeks since we haven't been here. We're obviously getting closer to safrinha corn harvest, and we're seeing more in the way of bean movement. We've seen China become engaged with new crop 26 purchases. So let's give us a little bit of a overview, if you will, of what's been taking place in Brazil here over the last couple of weeks.
Okay, let's go. Yes, that's a yeah. It's not a new thing, but every year, when China starts trading the May contract, the next year new crop, the reference for Brazilian new crop, and then we have a more interest because they can lock the board crash. But at this time, they not only it's interesting, not only locking the board crush, which is not involve the local basis, for example, for soybean meal, which is the most important, but this year differently, the locals and the users, feed mills, they are more eager to buy more soybean meal for the next year. The point is, it's very cheap, and the ratio between the hog price and the flat price of soybean meal for the next year is very attractive for them. Even though if the hog prices keep at this low level, but the point is, feed prices are very low because of the soybean in the end. And the soybean, Brazilian soybean is very cheap for the new crop. So China is more active, and farmer selling Brazil is active the same way, because producers, they purchase a lot of inputs, and they need to control the exposure, the risk of this ratio, the barter ratio, and tradings are make money. So everyone is happy to do business, and then China is more active, mainly for the new crop.
Now, you kind of mentioned it, I think, at the beginning, but this isn't unusual. This isn't something that, it isn't being driven by the trade war, or do you think that it is, in your opinion? Is it just a normal practice because margins are good?
I would say it's not related to the trade war, because the last year, I was looking today, it's the same, exactly the same number of cargoes China purchased the last year at the same time, 44 cargoes, and now
Hmm.
40. So very similar. So in my opinion, it's not because of the tariffs and trade war, but this is because of everybody wants to reduce the risk. The end user in China, the soy meal is very cheap. Brazilian farmers, they need to sell something. They need to speed the farmer selling, because it's too low, and the crop will be larger than this year
Hmm.
because of the acre expansion. And tradings, they are long, so they need to reduce the longs. I would say it's because of the market.
It just makes sense. The market's telling people to do it, and they're doing it. They're listening, if you will.
Yeah, it's liquid, so let's do something.
What are you seeing with Safrina? We're getting started. We did see, was it AgroConsult come out today at 112 million metric ton? That's a big number. I won't ask you to comment directly on their number necessarily if it makes you not, like don't want to put you in a box or a corner by any means, but thoughts on Safrina production? Obviously it looks like we've had a good year so far. Looks like the finish will be decent for Mato Grosso. Any sort of concerns with, and we'll kind of lean on Nick too with his weather insight, but thoughts on crop size and how far are we from really truly being out of the woods, when it comes to production risk and Safrina.
The only risk now is the frost is that we have a, and I'm going to let Nico talk about that. But we have at the end of the month here in Brazil, in Paraná, here in my state. So we have quarter, I think. The corn here could suffer something quality or even failure because of the a big frost and the maps yesterday. Today I didn't see yet, but yesterday for the end of May and June 1st, and then it's very big area, white one, so below zero, so the risk is here. But overall, the other regions are very, very nice, and some farmers, they just started the harvest. The yields are amazing. They need space. I don't know about 112 million tons, but tradings, uh, they still range between 104, 110 million tons, and then we have this 112, and Conab is 100.
Right.
So it's big. Everyone are, consensus is 10 million, 15 million more than last year, and we have to compete. That's the point.
Let's go to Nick then and look at the weather. And I'm going to build off from that too because we've had some Argentina weather stories hitting the headlines as well. But let's talk about the risk to the safrina crop at the end of the month. If there is, obviously the models are starting to show it, but anything that you were seeing out there, or is it just a couple errant maps that are flashing the risk? Like, what is the thought on weather here? Across Brazil as we wrap up the month, and then we'll keel over to Argentina and kind of talk a little bit about what's going on there.
I mean, Sabrina looks good, and we keep climbing higher. So as far as frost is hard, we as far as sort of the maps and this model versus that model, I asked the AI, I ask Andy, and he tells me, and which one's been more accurately leaning towards. So it's going to get cold. Frost, how much it impacts, it's really hard to quantify. So in general, it's not like a persistently cold 2 weeks, and I don't think it's gonna be a hard frost. We did flag the fact that that part of Brazil is just generally staying wet. So, maybe it's a little more, but it's nothing today that we don't see it as being, generally a non-event. And usually frost is, so yeah, I don't, it's not something we'll probably spend even a lot of time writing about.
Be more of a impact and probably quality potentially. Like eventually you may see a reduction overall in movement or whatever, but like it's one of those where you don't know what it's happened until it's happened kind of deal.
I
That's
mean,
having experienced a third week of September frost, which I think is relatively close to the equivalent of this one. Like it's late enough in the season, the crops generally made, it'll probably just take the top, very top on, if you will.
and
But
that part of the country's been extremely warm this year, so
mhm.
you're probably pretty far along.
Yeah,
Considering that where you were delayed planting was almost all in the north, so the second crop. So it's just probably not an event, but people write about it.
I'm one of them people. And as it stands, What are we seeing in Argentina then? Also talking about what folks are writing about and talking about. There was an article, I think this morning, that had quoted a farmer saying he was just staring at a sea of water. And so obviously there is some level of drama associated with that, I would say, though when you're experiencing something like that at the end of a season, it does feel like it's, just never going to improve. But what are we talking about real area wise that's being impacted by these floods? And then any insight, do you have any on the quality issues that we're hearing about with reduced protein out of Argentina, and whether that matters as we move ahead?
Yes, I mean, one of the ways we look at it is kind of summing up aggregate areas. I mean, the province of Buenos Aires has gotten, 300% of normal, primarily coming in a 100 square kilometer area. Um, so the one thing I'd say is like these events are somewhat frequent in Argentina. We actually have like we're farming in the north. Last year they had a very similar freak event in Corrientes, flooded out the whole town. There was one, not too far away, La Plata, couple, decade ago. But from a soybean standpoint, it's probably not a big deal. Like, we're kind of 300 to 500,000 ton range as, potential losses, maybe a million at the max. It probably gets washed into the total number. People are still kind of hiking. So, Rosario goes from 45 half to 48 half into 48. Okay. So I just don't think it's a big deal. I mean, primarily the biggest thing is harvest. The difference, it's slowing harvest. Probably trucks fell off by 1,500 on the week, but they've got a lot of beans coming down the river. So I think Javier reported percent of crush in April was 25%, which is high, but well, it's not high compared to the last 5 years, but that part of that's the bad year they had 22, 23. So, really, it's a good sign. It's a sign that they're going to have more beans to crush. I think the biggest question there is just going to be bean exports and people down here, you've had guys whispering 10, 11. It's probably not realistic. They just probably shouldn't let them go. I think, but so much of that ends up being a function of this US, China issue. So as far as the trade flows go, we'll lean heavily on Eduardo, and he can tell us when Brazil doesn't have quite enough beans, and then they can, choose between the US and Argentina. But I think, if you look at USDA numbers, you take the over on the crush right now, try to keep them in the country and process. The bigger development this week, so a couple things. Last month, government ran like I think a 0.6% GDP surplus, huge. So again, very good sign. So they had the Buenos Aires Cava elections, and the map is incredible. If you went a decade ago, it was all pro, which is Milei's party. Milei, he lost in the last 8 years, I think 28% of the vote. Milei picked up 18 from a year ago. Kind of puts in perspective, and massive swings. So the left wing was relatively steady, but massive fracturing in their party from the kind of, they call it the Kirchner, the bit of the mafia family, away from them towards Kisilov and some of these new factions who are kind of branching out. So what that means is that Milei, they're going to try to ride this hard into the October midterms. So they're going to extend grain, the tax reductions, at least, as a election getting. So you'll see corn, wheat exports stay strong, registrations. You've seen pretty good registrations across the board. So in general, I'd say just fairly, other than the floods, fairly good news all around for the farmers at the moment.
Mhm.
And just the economy. They're really going to try to, I think, push quite a bit through here with this momentum they have.
Interesting. Let's talk about that. That was one of the things you
I
kind of
would,
brought up. Yeah, go ahead, Eduardo.
I would say the one thing is logistics.
Mhm.
We could say we could see something similar that we see in Brazil this year because of the very slow harvest. Because Argentina sold 20 cargoes for China, for May and 15 for June. Then the registrations exports, it's like around 1.6 million tons. The exported could use less than that, 9%. So it's very close to 1.5 million tons, 1.3 million tons. So that's the point for May. And we are in the end of May. We could have any kind of problem, short squeeze, logistics, like we have seen in Brazil this year. And then the end of the story is our soybean, in my opinion, is too cheap. And then it's it's been good for crushers in Argentina. They are make money because of the farmer selling is very strong, and origination cost is very low. The opposite in Brazil. Then, if that happens, so the soybean increase in terms of replacement cost, and then we may say soybean meal, it's too cheap, and I don't think so. This is going to last for longer because in Brazil the the crushing margin is very bad for June, July, and August, and Argentina could turn could to a worse, not so good scenario from July onward. And this thing of Argentina and the short squeeze could move bases in Argentina up, like we see in Brazil. I think in the end, soybean meal could move up a little bit the flat price, and we start to see something like that this week. Even with the soybean meal in CBLT moving up, not strong, but a little bit. So the end of story, I think the soybean meal, the buyers should take a look to the whole curve. The flat price is too cheap for the second semester in Brazil, for example. I'm advising the end users to increase the coverage of the soybean meal because it's too cheap. For example, OND Brazil traded this week 2 over CBOT December, which is very cheap for the second semester. Even if we have a good amount of soybean, but we never know. For example, La Nina could show up, and then Argentina, we never knows in terms of the speed of planting and the written sunnies that is going to back to the 33%. So, in my opinion, this is the main point.
So quick question. And that's why he's the guru.
Right.
Do you put any weight in this bird flu risk? Because I think,
Yeah.
I mean, that would be the only thing that probably frees up a reasonable amount of meal, no?
Yes, that's one thing that we had to make sure if Brazil will, if we are going to have more and more, sporadics, but more cases of the um, in terms of new cases, and then for sure we had to reduce the soybean meal and corn usage in Brazil. That should be a very bad thing to soybean meal in Brazil. More soybean meal going to FOB, but we're still waiting for the two tests in commercial farms. One in north of Brazil and another is in the heart of the poultry and hog producing region, which is Santa Catarina. We're still waiting for that.
How long do you think we should be here today, tomorrow? Do they have a deadline
Yeah,
or deadline
should
on?
come today
Good.
because I heard 4 days, three, four
Okay.
days, working days. So should be today. Let's
Was
see.
the token teens, was that commercial or was that because I know that one was cleared, right? That concern or that case was clear. Was that a bird? That might have been backyard though. It's hard to keep track.
Oh yes, because the this time of the year is normal.
Yeah.
The birds come and go from the Argentina and moving to somewhere else. So the risk, but the point is Brazil. we have a very good control measures, and
Hmm.
all the farmers they use the vaccines every year. The opposite, I think, in the US, they prefer not to vaccine use vaccines. In Europe, the same. But in Brazil, we sterilize all the herd, you know. So it this is the people here, BRF, for example, JBS, they are very confident. In 30 days, we'll get back to the market, but never knows.
So we basically, for those watching at home, we are holding our breath for the next 30 days to a certain
Oh
extent.
yeah, we
Um,
need 30 days to back. So
yeah,
if we
because
have a new outbreak, and then more 30 days, and then
that's what it is for the reasons that Eduardo and Nick just discussed. It can impact because you're not going to repopulate the barn if you if you struggle with exports. If the export side of Brazil's poultry industry is limited or continues to be limited due to restrictions because of bird flu around the world, then the thought is they aren't going to repopulate the birds. You're going to have less mouths to feed, and that would reduce your soybean meal and corn usage. And obviously one of the things that we've been talking about quite a bit is the increase in corn usage in Brazil for feed and for ethanol. And how, that does help to offset a bit in the way of the increased production, like you're talking 10 to 15 million metric tons more of overall corn production this year versus last. So to see a reduction in feed demand, it would carry over into the exportable surplus, most likely. And one of the things that we have seen recently in Brazil is just kind of a freeze. It feels like a frozen trade right now while folks wait to a certain extent on the corn side. Do you think trade wise, ethanol or feeders haven't been too aggressive? Is that more coverage or is that because they're uncertain over demand as we move forward?
ethanol guys, they are increasing because it's
Okay.
cheap, but their average are not so great because they start buying 10% above the actual the current levels, so they are not so eager to cover. They are waiting for more pressure, but I don't know. I think in June we have a window opportunity because farmers they need to sell because of the space, beans or corn. I think both, but the other guys, mainly poultry, they are very they are very slow in terms of increasing the coverage for corn and mainly for soybean meal.
Interesting.
I heard big guys they are reducing from 15 days to 7 days right now.
Of holding. That makes sense. Nick, were you going to add something?
No, no, I just think, maybe Eduardo, give a quick, idea of how big that poultry operation is in that part of the world. I'm not sure everybody in the US or in some other places is familiar.
Oh yes, the exporters. We export 5 billion tons of chicken, which is the most cheapest. Is the most the cheapest in the world, and we have some barriers, of course, from China because they produce and then they can choose to ban our chicken. But for example, Japan, they don't produce anything. So they need to keep buying not from Rio Grande do Sul, which is the first outbreak, but from Santa Catarina. They keep buying. In the end, big guys they say, for example, BRF, yeah, this is the price negotiation because they need to buy and they can't wait because otherwise they need to buy from the US, for example, which is much more expensive, the double compared to our price here. Um, so the price matters and the volume the same. So Brazil is big player.
Let's talk a bit. One of the things that you guys had mentioned, or one of the things that you'd mentioned when discussing Argentina versus Brazil and trade and some of that is logistics. And I think when it comes down to it, We tend to forget logistics, and it's been one of the conversation points that we've had quite often where just because it says something on a balance sheet doesn't mean that is what is available in the pipeline, right? That doesn't mean that it's easy to access soybeans or corn or whatnot. Logistics have a huge influence on market share and trade flow and all of that. So let's talk a little bit about that market share side of things, the soybean side of things. Eduardo, we've had a lot of folks recently, and this is kind of building on the trade war conversation. But there has been a conversation as of late that basically China could zero out all bean purchases from the US and buy only from Brazil or Argentina. In your opinion, is that possible? And if not, why? If yes, I guess lay it out. But what are your thoughts on market share there and the reality at ground level when it comes to the idea that we could zero out purchases from the US entirely from China?
I, I would say it's very unlikely. We see some very dramatic change, and making some simulations, and then in 1 year, China probably would need to reduce the crush in 20 million tons, if not by anything, out of the US. So it's not possible. If, particular in this year, because the feed production is increasing. Jan, Feb, March, and April increased 13% compared to the last year. The estimates of the market in China was only 3%. So it's growing because feed is very cheap. It's 40% below of the last year. And the last year was very expensive, very cheap. So overall in China, all the producers, not only poultry or hogs, they are using more feed. Then I think we don't have more we don't have enough soybean meal in China, or meal in China, to replace the soybean meal. I think it's impossible. Not say impossible, but very very small chance to reduce to zero the US. My number is at least 15 million, with 1% tariff or 1,000%. Doesn't matter that, because state companies, they even sometimes they say they don't pay the VAT, for example, to increase the margins, their margins. So it's government, they can do that,
The government
no
writes a
problem.
check to the government, basically, in this. From a tariff standpoint, in this issue, that would be kind of what you'd be looking at if Sino or Kofco were to be buying in. They're government entities at this point. Now, your
Yes.
private crushers may avoid U.S. beans, but your government entities aren't going to necessarily do that. What does that look like, though? Just kind of from an overall picture, Brazil is estimated, the USDA put Brazil's new crop bean exports at 112 million metric tons. Does that number fit in your opinion? And if it does, what are the grain flows? Does Brazil start to cut into our business with China? Obviously, if there is a trade concern there, do we see beans flow into our EU customers? Do they take our market share from Egypt, who's been a big bean buyer this year? Does that leave Brazil with much? Because China's imports 112, Brazil's exports 112. How does that all kind of shake out here, in your opinion, as we move forward?
Yeah, it's not possible, because Brazil always will be cheap during the 8 months of the year. So the other buyers can't, or it's not economic. It doesn't make sense to move to the West and buy there. The only if you are in the market with a small vessels, for example, Turkey, because of the oil, vegetable oil, are so expensive, and then makes sense to crush beans instead of buy, for example, sun oil. Then, because of that, Turkey, Egypt, other countries, they are increasing the crush, and they are increasing the purchase from the US. Then in the end, the answer is it's not possible because Brazil increasing the production will be cheaper and we will attract all the buyers, or most part of the buyers, including China. So the share of China here in Brazil, in the end, will stay between 70%, 75%. Because of that, they need to buy something out of the US. And they have the reserves. For example, this week, Sino is selling 2021, 22, 2023 beans. Brazil, some cases in the north of Brazil, you can't hold beans for 60 days because of it's too alive, the um, Brazilian beans, you can't hold for more than 6 months.
Just
So
doesn't work.
they need to change everything to avoid completely the US.
There's also there's also two other reasons that it's just not going to happen. You know, again, we get into this business and we think it's, and they talk about soybeans, and the only reason they talk about soybeans is it's all the US really exports, or it's the largest. But number one, they're not going to weaponize food very easily. Like even in the Russian war, you did not weaponize food, and so the supply chains, the crushing, to Eduardo's point, it's not in anybody's interest. The other item to keep in mind is, you know, what's really driving this chip technology, the race for AI, these things, like tariffs on low value goods, food, bulk commodities, especially ones that are not used in anything other than food, they're going to be the last ones that you're going to change, that's going to affect a population and you're going to make changes to. So it's just unrealistic to expect them, on the margin, they're going to buy what they need. They have no incentive not to. It's just the opportunity cost of the industry, the risk of not having it, the precedent of, again, getting into food. When you, even with the Russian-Ukraine war, they did everything. They're bombing ports, and the ships are still moving out. They're still finding insurance. They're going to do everything they can, I think, to keep this moving. And it's not in Argentina's interest to export more than a set number of beans, assuming they have some form of a crush margin. So, and then you sit on the back of all these unknowns with, ultimately the US crush industry, which, from the 45Z and just, how much demand they'll really have on the oil side. So I think you're in a bit of a wait and see, but I don't think anybody should be using a base case where 15 million tons or something isn't coming out of the US.
I agree. I'm glad that we could definitely touch on that because I think that's super important.
Yeah. And this year, Argentina protein is lower than the normal. The normal is 33%. Now it's 31.5%. So I have a big doubt if RG farmers, they will keep selling at this level, this speed, without retention reduction, because you can't make money paying at the same level, at the same price, Brazilian and Arg, because of the protein content, which is very low. You have to decrease below 70% your soy meal yield to have the same protein, comparing to Brazil, which is
Doesn't work.
a very bad to make margins. So crushers in China, they will keep buying from Brazil mainly, and maybe buy one or two boats from Argentina to make a blend. But the main origin will keep being Brazil, not Argentina. Because of that, I think the total export of soybean will not reach 5 million tons.
And that's another
Each
area
year.
where, yeah, Argentina can improve a lot, will be the seed technology. And I've heard estimates as high as 40 to 50% of beans, aren't, IP protected. So I think that'll be another area where you'll see big improvements in the years to come with these changes.
gonna be interesting to watch. Carl, any questions on trade flow, market share, or anything that you want to kind of toss out there before we move over and grab a quick weather rundown to wrap up this week's conversation?
Excuse me. The only thing I want to ask is, both this week out of Argentina and Brazil, we've seen the meat lobby groups over in China. Argentina, that's what, 74% of Argentine beef goes to China, and well, I think 43% out of Mato Grosso goes, the production there. I don't think the bird flu affects beef trade at all. What do you guys see out of these meat lobby groups? Do you think it increases the beef trade and improves relations between South America and China with them making their visits this week?
What do you think, Nico?
I mean, I think for all the talk, Argentina's trade with China is only increasing, and they're making, an effort there. So I think cattle, like feedlot production in Argentina, is up 6% year on year. They've got a small amount now of high cut beefs they send to the U.S. I think they're going to structurally look to push, higher, develop higher quality flows to more developed countries and become a larger trading partner either way with China. I don't think it really has anything to do with it. So I don't think for Argentina it's a big deal right now. But I do think like that flow is only going to grow, and there will be a lot of it. Like at the end of the day, growing a cow down here is just going to be a lot cheaper than the U.S. And so it just makes a lot of sense to. I mean, we're personally like that's going to be one of our areas of growth. So I don't see that changing, and I hope, and everything I've seen is positive, and I hope, growing that flow with China continues to be a growing priority.
Eduardo, any thoughts on your side?
For Brazil, of course, this is. I think it's the trend will keep growing in terms of flow to China, beef and poultry, all the meat. But the point is, Brazilian beef is the cheapest one. And if we take a look to the Chinese prices of beef, which is very low, so I think Brazil make a very important role to keep to increase the share in terms of beef export to China. And so in the end, I think Brazil will increase the production because we hit the lowest cycle in terms of production, and then it's keep increasing, and then we need China to give us profitability enough to feed the cattle here in Brazil. Then I think Brazil, being the cheapest one, will increase the share to China because people there are very tight fist, and then they care much more about the price of the meal and everything else. So Brazil, I think, is well prepared for that.
Interesting. Anything, Carl, you want to follow up with, or? Fits excellent. All right, we've got 5 minutes. I won't limit you to 5 minutes, but we've got about 5 minutes left in the conversation this week on and I wanted to kind of talk about weather. Like we've got a couple things popping up. Maybe let's start in China. You can kind of give a little insight. I know AIQ reduced their wheat production forecast in China this week. Maybe give us a little insight on what's happening there. We are moderating. It looks like high temperature wise, maybe not seeing the 105 degrees that everyone's been talking about, 110 degrees or what have you. But what are we seeing in China? What does it look like from an impact standpoint? And then roll over the Black Sea after that, if you will, and kind of fill us in on what you're seeing across Russia as well.
Yeah, I mean, China, it's been hot. It's just hot. We've been talking about it. I think we've cut like 9 million on wheat just from where we were. A lot of guys who don't want to cut are saying that it's irrigated area. It's just it's been extremely, almost 10% above normal. I can only that was the same as like Sao Paulo, that region last April when they had into the summer when they had that scorching heat wave. And I mean, you saw sugar eventually reacted. Um, so yeah, there's losses. But number one, you can't quantify them. Like I made a joke that it's like it's short Schrodinger's weather. You have both no losses and losses. You have no losses because the government's going to tell you don't have any, and your data isn't going to show it. And then you do have some because like the weather is bad.
Mhm.
So, what it ultimately is, we'll know later on when we reconcile trade flows and, ultimately. But I do think China's in a tough margin environment. I think this goes back to Carl's question. You have an environment of deflation, relatively structural. That's probably not actually hurting. That's probably helping them in the current situation versus like an inflationary environment in the US. So that, is going to reduce margins quickly and it's going to reduce demand. So like your millers and people are going to use a little bit less on the margin and it probably doesn't end up if your delta would normally be 0.9 imports to production, it might be 0.6 or 0.5. So it's going to take some of the pressure off that. So I would just caution, like, if it, you won't really know until they change the TRQ or until you really see them active. And even if you see them active, I mean, remember in 2020, they were buying everything and nobody believed it for 3 months.
They said it was going to cancel. Even it was 17 million metric ton position. They were shipping like hell wouldn't have it, and they were all going to cancel.
Yeah, so I just it's not anything we can trade. So, but yeah, it's moderating now, and you've got rains coming into that area. So, and I think we've just kind of said like we're anticipating a 5% sort of loss on summer areas up there. But again, like it's not a production cut yet. So, that's it. You've had some flooding in the south, pockets of trouble here and there. And you've had the government's come out and said, it's primarily been a winter wheat area or winter wheat problem. So take them,
Speaking of winter wheat problems, let's go over to Russia then. We had Rostov, the largest wheat producing region in Russia, declare a state of emergency. And before you think that means that, there's dust and whatever, like a state of emergency may not necessarily mean what you think it is. It's more of a crop insurance thing. From what I understand, it looks like a necessary mechanism to help kind of aid farmers in a time where it does look like you will see production reductions. But you had mentioned this morning, AIQ had in their update on just kind of a weather phenomenon that I am not going to try to pronounce. But what is that we're seeing? And, what, in your opinion, does that mean? I know it's hard to quantify again, like you said, like, and so many people get frustrated. They say, well, there's production issues, but they're not buying cash. Well, of course they're not buying cash. We're 3 weeks before harvest. No one's going to buy import in, size ahead of harvest, or you're not necessarily going to see the cash market firm either, because like you said, it's Schrodinger's weather. So fill us in a little bit on what you're seeing there and what you'll be watching just to wrap up the week.
you have other reasons you're not going to see it too. So Russia's running, I mean, they've been running lately, upwards of 4% plus monthly inflation, which, when you get that type of thing going on, especially they've been weakening the currency because of the fall off in crude and then OPEC's output. So right now, farmers are kind of getting hammered from the macro financial side. So they're not going to want to be active sellers anyways. So that's just something else to kind of put out there unless they, the government needs the tax revenue. So you're in a holding pattern, especially when you have potential weather coming at you. Overall, I mean, again, the state of emergency, I don't have any idea how much of it, I don't think a lot of it is actually production risk as much as, maybe more of a what if, getting ahead of these problems, especially again with everything else going on. We're still 83, 84 on wheat production. I don't see a reason to change. I don't know how to pronounce that word either, like Sukove, Sukevo. Yeah. And, but, kind of interesting. You've had some really bad ones. Like I just did a brief research on it but most of them haven't necessarily turned into big wheat problems. So it just really depends on timing. But they're fairly frequent winds. They come out of Central Asia. And if they hit right, and they're just not going to be hot enough. It looks like from what I can see, when they come a little later, they get over 35 Celsius. So, you start getting up into that mid upper 90s. That's when they just suck all the moisture out of everything, and you can do damage in, sub 48 hours. But and a big thing over there is the grain people know to look for them. So when they hear the winds, they get a report, that everybody's radar antennas up quickly, but the majority of the time, it again doesn't lead to a big problem. So, let's wait and see, but just put it on your radar because it's the right environment. But I just don't think you have the heat to make it into a real problem.
Definitely something to watch. Any other worries? Europe's got some problems. We have seen maybe more in the way of some rain building into parts of France or whatever, but Rory had mentioned from the Friars report this morning that there is some concern that it could limit some plantings in parts of the French production region that is, kind of relied upon for delivery or delivery on the physical market or for exports. So that could be interesting on the cash side. But again, probably not anything that shows up until we're deep into the year.
No, and the big one there was Northern Germany, because that's the
Hmm.
same up there, and they're actually going to get a bit of rain. So, and the temps have come down. So, I mean, the UK is probably the biggest actual little pocket of concern, but no, in general, it's I don't think you wouldn't be making any cuts yet on this. Just kind of
Production wise. Excellent. Anything else out there weather-wise that has your attention?
just keep an eye on like the first week of June in that kind of northern plains into Canada. It's
Okay.
gotten dried out. I think eastern US still a little wet, but again, nothing that no, it's quiet
Nothing
up.
that's super obvious, but to be completely honest, in my opinion, like and this might not be a popular opinion ahead of a growing season, but the last thing we need is a crop failure. You can have a crop hiccup and maintain demand and help support prices, but everyone acts like we need to have a 2012 style demise of a crop to generate any sort of tightness in world supply. And I'm not saying that that's even the direct, like, I'm not saying we need to go to $7 corn by any means, but I think it's super important to just kind of recognize how the balance sheet can shift in the US with, even just 94.5 million acres and a 175 yield, which is still a phenomenal crop, comparatively speaking. Like I think we just have to be really careful that just because there's not anything out there that is very blatant, obviously it doesn't mean that there aren't issues, but at the same time, and we'll talk out of the other side of my mouth and say just because there are small issues out there doesn't mean the market has to rally a buck. So we'll see and stay tuned. But yeah, Nick, any
One thing we're seeing a lot of, and this is what I would caution, is like the amount of people I've seen BAM weather and social media accounts, already calling for these big summer problems. Um, I kind of joke, but one of the problems with like all this quote unquote AI and data, then people that, you don't really know what you're doing, is like if you have enough data, any year can look like 2012.
yeah.
And now you kind of see the proliferation of this with everybody coming out and explaining why this is the year, this one thing.
Mhm.
There's 700 other things going on in the atmosphere.
Yeah, it's definitely something to watch, but yeah, I don't think there's anything out there right now that really stands out as is super super bad, but I will argue that we don't really want super super bad. I don't want to destroy demand. Like if you remember 2012, if you remember, like ahead of 12, we were building exports. We were really kind of growing market share. We hadn't had the fuel versus food arguments pop up. There'd been several different things that were kind of upended with a crop failure. So I never want to cheer for that at all. A major problem in the crops.
One last item is like, and this just goes back, you have a structural neutral rate in the US that is higher than where these, rates are. And costs aren't going to come down. And you had falling food prices. So you really don't want this right now. Like this would be one of these times with like the ongoing kind of fiscal support coming on the back end of this tax bill and stuff. This would not be a good time for anybody for a food problem.
I would agree with that. All right, let us call it a week. Anyone, any thoughts? I will go around. If you have anything, any final thoughts that you want to share. I don't really have much here for me. Everyone hears my thoughts all the time, so I don't need to share them. But how about you guys? Carl, Nick, Eduardo, anything that you guys want to throw out there to call it a week or to put a bow on this and wrap her up?
From my side, domestically, you gotta keep an eye on US corn acres. I think they're dropping rapidly. I think we take at least a couple million off from where we're at right now, if not more. And, globally, it's just all on trade deals. US and Japan meet on Friday. That's gonna be a big one. Japan has not been real willing to budge. And we have to remember, even if trade deals are done, there's still going to be tariffs there for us. And that's something globally that we're going to have to start working with at least for the next 4 years. So even if we have trade deals, don't expect tariffs to go away.
Well, Carl
Go
suggested
ahead, Ted.
corn
Yeah.
acres, but now I'm just gonna have to send him a private message.
I'm curious, Carl, what do you think the West will lose some acres? Only for corn and or beans the same way?
Um, my feeling on corn is 95.3 million acres. You have to have perfect conditions.
Okay.
South of us, Ohio Valley, Ohio, in that river basin through there. There's guys, it'll be a week before they can get into the field now. And that's if they get no more rain. And you start looking at this, and we're trading 450 D's corn right now. A farmer will take his insurance and just they'll just take prevent plant and take the insurance money instead of trying to mud in or force in a crop to get, you're barely at break even. And especially if you have it planted and it's flooded out, which is more of a problem further south in that southeast poultry market, starting to get into there. Even if the crop was planted, there's a call for replants. And again, the economics just do not favor trying to force in the acres that the USDA is touting.
Okay. And for beans, do you have any?
That's the thing. We can plant beans up until the 4th of July.
Okay.
I mean,
Yeah.
so I would say that, watch the futures, November soybeans starting to creep up a little bit. I wouldn't cut soybean acres right now, but I don't think I'd take them up either. Too much of a wait and see on that right now.
Okay. Good. Less corn. That we need that.
Yeah, I would
Too
agree.
much corn around.
It will be interesting to see how the spring plays out for a lot of folks in the Eastern Corn Belt, for sure. Because I already have growers in the area, that just based on my conversations with crop insurance agents are exploring their options. And we're 3 weeks away. But I think, with as poor as what it is and the worry that you're going to mud it in and have a big reduced yield and a big loss, it'll be interesting to see. So, with that, you guys, any last thoughts, Eduardo or Nick, and we'll call it a week.
I'm good.
In Brazil, just one thing, our currency, because in Brazil we had a try of the government to increase the public servants' salary wages, so we don't have space for that, and because of that, and because of the dollar outside, then maybe if the dollar turn and start moving up or just stop at the current level, Brazil maybe, I think, moving to the end of the year, our exchange rate will move up, so real will maybe weaker for the end of the year. Then the farmer selling will increase and our corn will make cheaper, and so on. So facts in Brazil, and the government is trying very hard to make a big mess at the end of the year.
And so one thing with that is, I think we've talked about, you have this kind of unholy trifecta in Argentina with the strong currency, high interest rates, and the export taxes. And so I do think that because ultimately inflation remains the enemy, that it might make export taxes a more likely target to be cut than the other ones, which again would be one of these things that favors grain in a pretty significant way relative to government revenue, which has been their priority. But now that their balance sheet's a little better spot, and that would really be a big win in the countryside. So just keep on your radar that maybe there could be these kind of incremental, more structural changes to taxes. I don't think you get them quickly, but they just the financial, the fiscal environment makes it a little tough domestically.
All right. Interesting. All of it. We will be back next week. I think I haven't looked at the calendar, but I don't think I have anything planned for any of us, but we'll see. If you guys have questions, the listening audience, make sure to reach out and ask them. We're here to answer them as best we can. But yeah, we'll be back next week with lots to talk about. Thanks for tuning in and checking it out, and see you next Thursday.
Okay, see you guys.